I recently made a video about why I love the S5II, but no camera is perfect, so I was going to add a few things that I didn't like so much about it. It turns out the pros video was rather long, so I decided to make a separate video about the negative aspects of this camera. For me, there's really only one main issue, with a few minor gripes. This crop factor in 4K 50 is the only real downside to the S5II as far as I'm concerned, as you lose a fair bit of width in your shot switching from 25 to 50 in 4K. It's probably not a big deal for most people, as you can usually move the camera around to compensate, but it's still limiting in certain circumstances. The main reason this is my personal least favorite aspect of the S5II is because I often shoot real estate videos with the S5II, so I really need to get the widest angle view out of my wide lenses. On the flip side, the crop actually assists you if you want to zoom into something, but if you need a wide shot, you're forced to crop in. This crop turns my 14mm lens into a 21mm, but thankfully the Full HD 1080-50p option is downsampled from the 6K sensor, and it looks fantastic. So it's no big deal, as the main benefit of shooting in 4K, or even 6K for that matter, is the ability to punch in during post-production without losing resolution, assuming that you do deliver it in 1080 of course. But you typically don't crop in much, if at all, on real estate gimbal shots in post, as you want the widest possible shot to show all of the room, within reason. You might want to further stabilize the shot in post, which will add a very tiny crop, but that won't degrade the image at all. Although not ideal, keep in mind that at the time of the release, a crop in 4K at higher frame rates was common at this price point, and it happened on even more expensive cameras like the Sony a7 IV. The updated Sony a7 V apparently doesn't have a crop or much of a crop, although it may be line skipped, I'm not sure, and I imagine that the S5 Mark III probably won't have this crop either. We'll have to wait and see. On another note, there's either no autofocus or just contrast-based autofocus with some of the higher frame rate options on the S5II, and I'll probably go over that in a later video. Well, that's my main issue out of the way, but there are some other minor things I wish the S5II had, starting with a tilt and flip screen like the GH7 and the new S1II series of cameras. It's not a big issue, but it would be handy at times. I would also like a dedicated photo and video switch that other cameras have, like some Sony and Canon models, as you can then set up all the custom settings differently for each mode, effectively kind of doubling the amount of programmable buttons and shortcuts. Now, they have added one of these switches to the brand new S1II series cameras, so maybe this is something Lumix will do going forward on all models. I certainly hope so. Last of all, I really wish the S5II could make use of the 32-bit float function on the XLR2 adapter like the GH7 and again the new S1II series can. But unfortunately, that's not possible due to hardware limitations or some other technical issues. But thanks to a firmware update, you can now use the XLR2 with the S5II, and you can use all of the functionality except for the 32-bit float. If you own an S5II and are in the market for an XLR adapter, and you can afford it, I would say get the XLR2 over the One model, as maybe one day you'll update your camera to something that can use the 32-bit functionality, and you'll appreciate that. Who knows, maybe it'll be an S5 III. Well, that's it. I personally can't think of anything else I would say is a con on this camera based on my usage and needs. And I've had this camera now for about 2.5 years, and that's really the only gripes I have with it, or things I wish could be updated. But to be fair, there are a few other things I've heard other users complain about that might be worth mentioning, and I'll give my opinion on these issues as well. I've seen a few people say that the build quality in the S5II is not quite premium. And well, for this price point, I guess it won't be. But it's very good and definitely professional looking and feeling in my opinion. It's certainly the most chunky pro-looking camera I've ever owned, and it has been noticed by some clients as well. The only non-premium bit of the body, in my opinion, is the SD card door. It feels like it's made of a bit cheaper basic plastic. It doesn't have any texture, and it's a bit flimsy, with a cheaper sounding and feeling click function when you open and close it. It also has no lock switch, which you don't really need. I've never come across a situation where it's accidentally opened up for no reason, because it certainly shuts tight enough and fairly securely, but the more expensive cameras seem to have the lock on this door. The SD door isn't bad in my opinion. It does the job well, and I've never heard of anyone having trouble with it or breaking it or it not shutting, etc., or flipping open for no reason, but it's certainly the least premium bit of the body, at least in my opinion. You could also argue that the rubber covers on the other side of the camera, over the microphone and headphones and HDMI, etc., are a bit cheapish as well, but I think they're fine, and of course they're made from that rubbery type of material for the weather sealing. I guess it would have been nice to have the separate doors like the S5II series have, instead of just the two big doors to open up a few things at once, which would also assist a bit more weather sealing, but again, at this price point, can't really complain. A lot of people have complained that there's no lock on the rear right dial and that it's very easy to bump and change your shutter angle or whatever as you're shooting. I can't say I've ever knocked this accidentally myself, but I can see how it could happen. And I agree it would have probably been nice to be able to lock this or at least move it a little bit further forward so that it's harder to accidentally bump. The S5II only has a 24 megapixel sensor. Some people thought this wasn't enough even back in 2023 when the camera was initially released. I consider this to be the sweet spot for almost any type of photography, except when you really need ultra high resolution for cropping or massively large prints that are going to be viewed up close, but not many people really need to do that. The S5II has the highest resolution I've ever owned on a camera, and it's also the highest resolution I'd want on a hybrid camera that focuses on video. I find a lot of the cameras that have much higher megapixel counts tend to suffer a little bit in low light performance because of that. Of course, some may consider this a con over some of the competition, like the A7 IV from Sony at the time, that was supposed to be in this price bracket, albeit about $1,000 more with no lens, but that camera does have a 33 megapixel sensor and some people really do need or want that extra resolution. However, I have seen some low light reviews on that camera that reveal it doesn't perform as well in low light as most Sony cameras do, or even the S5II does up to a certain point, and the reviewers usually point to the higher megapixel count as the possible reason. On a side note, as mentioned in my pros video, keep in mind that there is a 96 megapixel mode on the S5II for both RAW and JPEG images, and it can be used handheld, although of course it only really works in certain situations, such as when you're photographing a stationary subject, but it does offer a solution when it's possible to use it. The S5II has also been criticised for its somewhat slow writing speeds for photos. I've heard a few people complain that if they do long bursts of raw photos, it can take a while to buffer, and it can brick the camera if they try to review the images before the buffering is cleared. Now, I haven't experienced this myself, as I very rarely shoot in burst mode, and when I have, it's usually only short bursts. But I don't want to brick my camera either, so I haven't tried to review images while it's still clearing the buffer. And I don't know if these people who have experienced this issue are using the fastest cards available, which are the V90s, or if they're using V30s or V60s, so I can't really comment on this issue other than to say that if it does happen, it's obviously not a good thing, but then I wouldn't recommend this camera to anyone who shoots a lot of action, needing long bursts like sports or birds or anything like that professionally. Like most other cameras with two SD card slots, you can configure them in different ways. The most common ways are to record both cards at the same time so that you have a backup of what you're shooting, or to shoot in a relay mode, meaning that when card 1 or card A fills up, the camera automatically switches to card 2 or card B. And this means that you can effectively double the time you can shoot for if you have two cards with the same storage. Now, when I switch between these two modes on my XA cameras, the recording display information changes. In dual recording mode, it displays the amount of video I can record on a single card. Because you're recording to both at the same time, effectively, you only really have the space available on one card. The other card is just a backup. That's assuming, of course, that both cards are the same size and have the same storage. However, when I switch to relay mode, the amount of video time I can record doubles, as you would expect. On the S5II, for some reason, it seems to show the amount of space on a single card only. I don't know why that is or if I'm doing something wrong, and I would love to know if there's a way to change this. But so far, in the nearly 2.5 years I've had the camera, I haven't figured out a way to do it. There are reports of a lag in the image when using a HDMI monitor. Apparently you can reduce the lag if you switch off audio monitoring to the monitor, and that helps a lot. And I think there might have been a firmware update to further reduce this issue. I'm not sure, as I rarely use a monitor on the S5II, at least so far, and when I do, I'm typically shooting interviews or things of that nature where there's not much movement happening, so the lag isn't as noticeable as it would be if I was shooting action like a football game. But this is something I probably wouldn't do or recommend for this camera, and that's partly because of rolling shutter. Yes, there's been a lot of complaints about the rolling shutter on the S5II, and I agree, it's not great. But again, it's on par with other cameras in this so-called price point, at least those that were released around the same time. You can reduce the rolling shutter issue in video by cropping into APS-C and or shooting in 50p, and in photography by also cropping into the APS-C and using a mechanical shutter. The rolling shutter, in my opinion, isn't terrible in most normal type of situations, but again, if you're shooting lots of action, fast-moving wildlife or sports, particularly with, sticks or bats or whatever, rackets perhaps, then you should be investing in getting a camera with a stack sensor or even a partially stacked sensor for faster readout speeds. Or if you can afford it, get one with a global shutter like the Sony A9 III. But of course, that all comes with a heavy price hike, so you have to decide how important rolling shutter performance is to you and what you shoot. The S5II doesn't have a low-pass filter, so the images are very sharp, and this can lead to some aliasing in certain circumstances. I've had this happen a little bit now and then, but to me, I haven't found it to be a big deal. I find that using a ProMist filter or even doing some subtle softening in post can help or even fix the issue. It's also not uncommon for these types of cameras these days either, so it's something that you kinda gotta live with. The S5II doesn't have any ProRes, RAW or all-eye options. Now, I really don't think most people who are after a camera at this price point really need these types of options. I know I certainly don't, but if you do, you could spend a bit more and get the S5IIX. With that camera, it comes with internal ProRes, some options at least. It has all intra options, and you can also shoot RAW video over HDMI. You can also do this with a paid upgrade for the S5II if you need it. I think it's around $200 or $250 Australian, something like that. But I've never bothered with it. Again, if you need those kind of more pro codec features, you really need to spend more money, get a camera that has the faster cards, and so forth. But personally, again, I think if anyone is in the market for the S5II, then you probably don't really need those options. I think personally that 4-channel audio is a massive bonus, but some people hate the fact that this camera always records or presents 4 channels, and you can't switch it off, so you always get channels 3 and 4 even if there's nothing on them. And I get this complaint, especially if these people are editing in older style track-based NLEs, where there is a risk of overwriting certain tracks with the extra audio tracks that you don't even need or can't use. Now, I love that this can use 4 channels, and given that I edit on Final Cut Pro, it's not an issue for me because of how Final Cut sort of uses its compact clips and of course the magnetic timeline. But Final Cut Pro also has an option where you can check a box that deletes any silent tracks when you're importing a clip, which solves the problem completely. Now, I don't know whether other NLEs like Premiere Pro or DaVinci Resolve have that option. I'd be surprised if they didn't, but maybe they don't. In any case, I love having a camera that can shoot 4 channels of audio these days, and I pretty much avoid cameras that don't now. Although I praised the autofocus in my S5II Pro's video, it's not perfect, though I don't know of any autofocus that is. I personally find the autofocus to be very reliable, especially after the last few updates, but there's still some people who claim Sony and Canon autofocus is much better. I can't really comment on this as I haven't used the latest Canon or Sony cameras, but I would agree that the new autofocus on the flagships of both of those companies would undoubtedly be more precise and sticky, especially with features like the AI autofocus, iFollow autofocus, and of course the function where you can take a photo of a person and the camera recognizes that person and will only focus on them. These are all great features to have, but again, let's keep it real for the price point. And for this price point, I think the S5II more than holds its own now in terms of autofocus. So while it's not the best on the market, I still think it's very good. Anyway, judging by this list, the S5II might sound like a pretty terrible camera, so maybe I should sell it and get something else. Well, I'm just kidding. I still love this camera, and I still think it's one of the best bang for buck cameras available on the market today. But of course, it has some issues. All cameras do. Well, actually, everything does for that matter. And to be honest, most of the cons I mentioned in this video, I don't consider much of an issue, at least not in the way I use the camera. But I wanted to be fair and mention some of the issues that might sway you one way or another if you're thinking about buying this camera or something else. At the end of the day, there's no such thing as the perfect camera for everyone at any price point for every situation. Even if you had an unlimited budget, you couldn't find the perfect camera. But I have to say, for my needs and the budget, the S5II comes pretty close.